He is the former president of Iran and may be the future president of Iran. He is probably the second most powerful figure in the country. He is a survivor of the 1979 revolution, someone who has been there all along. He dealt with the United States. He was the Speaker of the Parliament during the Iran-Contra affair in the mid-'80s. He was the one who helped arrange the purchase of U.S. arms, and the money went to the Contras in Central America, as you might recall. He is a very wily guy. And he was complaining about U.S. policies, which he thinks have been short-sighted. He, at the same time, was suggesting that he's ready to deal with the United States if he comes back into power, that there is a deal to be made on the nuclear issue, on a lot of other issues that are outstanding between our two countries. It was 8 years ago to Mike Wallace, so I was rather proud to get this interview. It took some doing. The timing was very good. As you know, President Bush had just referred to Iran once again in his State of the Union address, talked about standing with the Iranian people as they stand for liberty. We stand with you. Condoleezza Rice had called Iran an outpost of tyranny in her confirmation hearings in the Senate, so there was something for him to respond to. But he also was using me as a way to launch his campaign. He has not formally declared his candidacy, but he will in a couple of months. Most Iranians expect him to. The election's June 17th. So he has technically a couple of months before he has to declare. He's testing the waters. He's putting out, trial balloons. He's negotiating with other members of the establishment there to see who would get what job if he's elected again. He doesn't want to be rejected by the people. I think he's a little worried about that because he's a rather controversial figure. Not everybody likes him in that country, but there is a sense that he is somebody who can manage the affairs of Iran and perhaps solve the problems with the United States and with the international community. The president now is Mohammad Khatami, who is a rather tragic figure, I would say, in some ways. He was elected in 1997. He promised in a famous interview with Christiane Amanpour of CNN to start a dialogue of civilizations with the United States. He half apologized for the hostage crisis. And he actually did have an effect. I mean, he improved Iran's relations with the West, with the Gulf states. He managed to liberalize things a little bit within the country, but in the end he couldn't deliver on most of his promises, and he's now regarded as a kind of failed experiment by most Iranians. None whatsoever. We told him we would run the entire transcript on our website. I mean, we have that option now, but there were absolutely no conditions placed on it. Let's see, I've been there 5 times. I first started going after I joined USA Today. In fact, it was my first foreign trip for USA Today. I went to Iran in 1996. I went to Iran and Egypt to talk about women's rights in Muslim countries. This was after the Taliban had just consolidated power in Afghanistan, and I thought it would be interesting, and my editor thought it would be interesting, to look at the situation of women in other Muslim countries. Then I went back again in '98. In '99 and 2001. It's a fabulous book. I mean, I think it's a book that it's about Iran, but it's about women, it's about literature, it's about life. And I think it's just touched a chord. It's beautifully written, for starters. I read it, after I read it, I went back and reread Henry James and a little Nabokov and so on, because I wanted to reread the texts and kind of go back through it. I mean, it's a book club in Iran during the revolution and right after the revolution. It's a fabulous idea and very dramatic, and her own life is in there. But yeah, life has changed a lot. In fact, after that book came out, there were a number of complaints in Iran that, this is from the old days, life has changed. And if you look at some of the pictures I brought back and that have appeared with some of my stories, you can see that women are no longer draped head to toe in black. That particular picture, there's one that I took, and then there's one that was taken by a professional photographer. She did a much better job than I could in showing the variety now that you have on the streets of Tehran. The woman in pink, I call it the pink revolution. I saw so many women wearing pink. It was incredible. And I flew into Tehran from Paris, where everybody was wearing pink. All these young women are wearing pink. Yeah, and also you see it says sale. 8 years ago, when I first went to Iran, there was almost no English anywhere on any of the signs. Now all the signs of the fashionable shops are in English. It's a protest. It's a way to show we're part of the world, Yeah, you know, we're part of the world. We're not excluded from the world. We want to look like everybody else. We want to dress like everybody else. And this is a society where they reimpose the hijab. This is the veil. After the revolution, very quickly decided that women had to be covered. Everything but their face, their hands, and their feet had to be covered. And most of the women, really for the first 20 years of the revolution, were wearing chadors, which are these all-enveloping black tents. You see one of them in the picture there. Now it's very rare to see a chadori in Tehran, and certainly among young girls you almost never see chadori unless they're at prayers, in which case they might be wearing a white or a flowered chador. But now, as I write in the article, they're obeying the letter of the law, but not the spirit. The coats are short, they're wearing tight jeans, high-heeled boots, and the scarves are so tiny, you know, and they're bright pink or whatever. So they're showing really that they want to be just like everybody else and that they don't feel that this kind of Islamic dress is necessary. A lot of people speak English, more than you would imagine. A lot of the young people speak English. So it's really easy to talk to them on the streets. I used a translator for the official interviews because I wanted, obviously, even though a lot of the officials speak English as well, I used a translator. There's an interest section, which actually is standalone in Georgetown, where you get your visa. But of course it has to be approved by the foreign ministry in Iran, and there's also something called the Ministry of Islamic Culture and Guidance, which deals with foreign press. And it's a long and difficult process. I took Air France. It was a nice way to go. I stopped in Paris on the way, which is an even nicer way to go. Well, I mean, you fly to Europe, and then it depends on how long the layover is. It's a 20-hour ordeal, basically. Live in Tehran. Whole country is about 70 million now. It's homogeneous, largely homogeneous. It's about almost 90% Shia Muslim. It's the largest Shiite population, I believe, anywhere, and has a lot of influence, needless to say, on countries like Iraq, Lebanon, where they're also large Shia. It's right next door. I have, yes. 60%, it's believed, yeah. You know, we've done the Iranians a huge favor. We got rid of their two worst enemies, which were the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which was Sunni and militantly opposed to a Shia minority in Afghanistan. Then we got rid of Saddam Hussein, also a Sunni dictator, wielding power over a Shia majority. So many issues. It goes back to the revolution, goes back to 1979 when the Shah was overthrown. He was our ally. In fact, we put him back on the throne in 1953 when there was a very popular elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, overthrown by the CIA. First big overthrow by the CIA, sort of taking over from the British. We put the Shah back on the throne. He had fled to Rome, and he became increasingly dictatorial and was overthrown in a popular revolution in 1979. During the course of that revolution, Iranian students seized the U.S. embassy and American embassy people as hostages, and the government, revolutionary government of Iran, instead of ending it, prolonged it as a way to defeat their internal enemies. Unfortunately, they alienated the rest of the world, and the United States in particular, and that is the root, really, of all the problems that we have with Iran today. How did the CIA do it? There's a good book by Stephen Kinzer, formerly of the New York Times, about how it was done. It was a classic CIA coup, you know. We paid people, we found people who would go out in the streets and demonstrate against Mossadegh, for the Shah. Army strongman was brought in who was loyal to the Shah. They tried, I think, one Army Chief of Staff. He wouldn't do it, so they went to somebody else. They also mobilized the religious community, interestingly enough. There was an Ayatollah who was known as the CIA Ayatollah, Ayatollah Kashani, who came out in support of the Shah and against Mossadegh. Mossadegh was painted as a communist when he was not. He was a nationalist, not a communist. But in that environment, when the Cold War had really just begun, the U.S. decided, with encouragement from the British, who were angry that their oil interests had been nationalized, they decided that this was a communist threat and must be undone. It has enormous oil resources, enormous gas as well. It should be a very wealthy country. That it's not is because of gross mismanagement and corruption. No longer. We did, I think indirectly, until President Clinton slapped comprehensive sanctions on the country in 1995. It is the gap. They buy the clothes in the Gulf, in Qatar, in Dubai, and then they bring them into Iran and they sell them at a premium. These are two of the Gap salesmen. As you can see, they're clean-shaven and they have long hair, which is another form of protest. The women wear pink, and the men defiantly wear no beards. Again, it's something that's encouraged. A devout Muslim man is supposed to have a beard, supposed to wear conservative clothing. So if you wear a short-sleeved polo shirt and you're clean-shaven, this is a show of defiance. Another way the men show their defiance is by shaking hands with women in public. Unrelated women. You're not supposed to do that. And it was very funny. I have a friend there, a young man. He's in his early 30s. And I've seen him almost every time I've gone. And every time I see him, there's an evolution. The first few times I saw him, he had a beard, full beard and so on. And he wouldn't touch me, wouldn't shake my hand. This time, he met me in the middle of my hotel. He was clean-shaven. He was wearing a suit and a tie, which was also unusual. He stuck his hand right out and grabbed my hand in the middle of the lobby of the hotel. I was stunned. I mean, I would never offer my hand to an Iranian man in public. It wasn't done. This time I was a lot freer. You still have to cover, so I was wearing pantsuits, but they had a waistline, which was forbidden before. And so I was wearing conservative pantsuits and a little scarf, you know, brightly colored. I brought a lot of brightly colored scarves with me so I wouldn't feel too dull. In the past, I've had to wear a long, baggy raincoat everywhere over my pantsuit, and it was extremely uncomfortable and extremely hot. And this time I didn't have to. Crowded, crowded, crowded. It's about 10 million, they think 12 million. It's very spread out, a lot like Los Angeles. Very spread out. And the traffic is unbelievable. I've never seen such traffic jams anywhere. I would bring my laptop with me in half the time in my car so I could work. I could write in the back seat, because there would be times when you'd be stuck for an hour or two trying to get from one part of Tehran to another. The country is run by a clerical elite. There is a supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who is nominally, and not entirely nominally, he's in charge really, but he has a circle of close advisors. Rafsanjani is one of them. There are various clerical bodies which vet candidates, which mediate when there are disputes between the elected parliament, between the president and the religious leader. You know, it's a group of maybe 1,000 clerical families that run the country. They are the ruling class of Iran now. Well, they took it during the revolution. It was a popular revolution, but what they did was that they systematically barred their secular and their clerical opponents from running the show. And now they have a system whereby they vet the candidates for parliament, for president. It is more democratic than in many places in the Middle East because the elections are contested. There are candidates, more than one candidate for every seat, but it is very restricted. There are various bodies. It's kind of a parallel government. You have a president and a cabinet that's elected, and Khatami was elected very enthusiastically twice, the president. You have a parliament, which is popularly elected. But in the last parliamentary elections last year, many candidates were barred from running, including most of the incumbents from the previous parliament, which was very reform-minded and rather popular. You have the supreme leader and all the people around him. You have kind of, as I said, parallel organizations. So you have an army, and then you have the Revolutionary Guards, which is more powerful in some ways than the conventional army. You have paramilitary groups, Ansar-e Hezbollah, the Basij. These are groups largely controlled by the leader of Islamicists who go in and break up demonstrations. You have a judiciary which has a minister of justice, but also gentlemen who are controlled by the leader. They're responsible for closing newspapers, for arresting bloggers, opponents of the regime, assassinating people, not so very long ago. Up until about 1996, 97, intellectuals were murdered on the streets. Yes. I had 4, which was a record for me. I've never had 4 such interviews. I interviewed Rafsanjani. I interviewed Hassan Rouhani, who's the National Security Advisor of Iran. I interviewed Hussein Mousavian, who's one of their top nuclear negotiators. They're having negotiations with the Europeans about their nuclear program. And I interviewed a gentleman named Mr. Haji, who's in charge of Iraq affairs in the Foreign Ministry in Iran. I did. I interviewed his son. It was a very interesting interview. He was quite candid. I was actually quite surprised by some of the things he had to say. By and large, Iranians were very pleased about what's going on in Iraq because they know that the Shia are going to have major power there. I haven't tried. The Iranians can fairly easily. I assume they have to show a passport and so on, but many of them have been going to Karbala and Najaf, the pilgrimage cities in Iraq. Of course, the Iraqis charge that thousands of Iranian intelligence agents have come across the border and are fishing in troubled waters. Well, this is actually a function partly of the hostage crisis and of Iran's isolation after the revolution. Saddam Hussein, who had coveted parts of Iran, oil fields and so on, and who was worried about destabilization of his own regime because of the Shia majority in Iraq, decided he would take advantage of Iran's isolation, and he attacked Iran in 1980. The war went on from 1980 to 1988. At first it was Saddam, as I said, who started it. Later on, the Iranians prolonged the war, thinking that they could overthrow Saddam. It was horrible. More than 1 million people killed and injured, 250,000 killed and injured in Iran alone. It devastated the country. It set it back enormously. But it also in some ways consolidated the revolution because Iranians are patriotic people. And they rallied around the government, even those that didn't like the government, because they wanted to defeat Saddam Hussein. There was an agreement that was reached that was mediated by the United Nations. It's not a formal peace, but of course they have relations, and I would imagine relations will improve enormously under the next Iraqi government. Let's see, it was the end of January through the beginning of February. So actually I left this country just as George Bush was delivering his inaugural address, and stopped in Paris and then went on in. I had wanted to go for some time. It took me months to get the visa. For so many reasons, we have all these issues with Iran now. The nuclear issue is the latest and the hottest, but we have issues with them as far as support for terrorism, support for certain groups in Iraq, their involvement in Lebanon, their involvement in the Arab-Israeli conflict. So many issues. It's always interesting to go there, and I hadn't been there. The last time I was there was right after the U.S. had overthrown the Taliban, so I thought interesting to go to Iran after we'd overthrown Saddam to see what the impact would be. No, you know, they're kind of dribbling us in one by one. They let the Washington Post in, then the LA Times, then me, then PBS right after me. So one by one they're allowing us in. I think they want to monitor us, that's part of it, but also they want to punish American reporters for the fact that they were not able to send many reporters here during the American elections. I was told that they wanted to send a lot of reporters in to cover the elections, and they were not given permission. I always stay in what used to be the Sheraton Hotel before the revolution. It's now called the Homa Hotel, and I like it very much, and the people there know me, and the food is good, and it's well situated for getting around. As I mentioned, there are these monster traffic jams, so you want to be in a place where you can get downtown and sort of around town fairly easily. They have a metro, but it's very limited, and so unfortunately everybody gets in a car. No, not that much, really. They would love to have more. Not many Westerners go to Iran. There's some Europeans with business there. Iranians travel, but not as much as they would like. Very well. They love Americans. I always compare it to the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s, where Americans were extremely popular. Most people do not like the government. I mean, if there were a free election, tomorrow they would get rid of that government in a heartbeat. And one of the ways that they show their contempt for the government is by showing their admiration for the United States. But they're also, you know, there are more than 1 million Iranian expatriates in this country. And they are the main traffic, frankly, Iranian expats going back to see family. So the average Iranian knows a good deal about the United States, and they like it. Oh, there are lots. A lot of them are in Los Angeles, which is called Tehrangeles because there's so many Iranians there. Many, many satellite stations and radio, and a lot of Iranians watch because, frankly, their own television is pretty boring. They've given up. They've given up. That was another thing. I mean, when I first started going, they would jam the stations. They would confiscate satellite dishes. They've given up. What he means is that, and this is another obvious sore point between our two countries, there's not much left of the Iranian Revolution, but one of its tenets is that Israel is a bad country, and they call it, you know, the Zionist entity, that it is illegitimate and that has no right to exist. Now, this is a view which is held by the most ideological members of the Iranian government. There are members of the Iranian government who also say, though, that if the Palestinians are able to reach an agreement with the Israelis, that Iran will not stand in the way. One of the people I interviewed, Hussein Mousavian, said Iran will not be an obstacle to an agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That said, Iran provides funding for a number of militant Palestinian groups that have committed suicide bombings, you know, and done quite terrible things. So it is a very sore point. I think if Iran's government were to say that they would recognize Israel's right to exist, that would go a long way toward easing the tension with the United States. It's really purely ideological. I mean, they are supporters of the Palestinian cause. Yasser Arafat was one of the first, in fact, I think the first foreign dignitary to arrive in Iran after the Iranian Revolution to express solidarity with Iran. There are a lot of ties that go back. It's ideological. The average Iranian could care less about the Palestinians and is furious that so much money has gone to support the Palestinians, that money that they feel should go to help Iran. It's, you know, it's common to Muslim fundamentalists really throughout the region. I mean, it's not just Iran, it's Sunni Muslim fundamentalists from Indonesia all the way through Morocco. Israel has no right to exist, according to these people. It was given this land illegitimately. It should belong to the Palestinian people. Look, it's a historic dispute, and one that, if resolved, would take the steam out of a lot of the opposition to the United States in that part of the world. The feeling is that the United States supports an illegitimate Israeli occupation of Palestinian land. Now, the most extreme fundamentalists would like all of Palestine to revert to Palestinians. The more pragmatic people, and I think this includes, frankly, most Iranian officials, want the West Bank and Gaza to be given to the Palestinians as a Palestinian state, and they would, you know, reluctantly, grudgingly accept the right of Israelis to have the rest. I studied Russian. I was a Russian major. I guess it's Washington now. I've lived here the longest of any of the places I've lived. I was born in New York City. I went to high school actually in Bethesda, Walter Johnson High School in Bethesda, Maryland, and I applied to all the good schools, and Harvard took me, so I went there. Actually, it was Radcliffe in those days. It was while I was in college that I decided I wanted to be a journalist. I had not really done journalism before. I wasn't on the high school paper or anything like that. I studied Russian, and in my second semester senior year, I went to the Soviet Union as a quote-unquote exchange student. I mean, they weren't sending anybody here, so it wasn't really an exchange. But I lived in Leningrad. I had a fascinating time. I really perfected my knowledge of the language, and decided that no American journalist had written about this place properly, and that it was my mission in life to write about the Soviet Union. I came back to the States and started writing. I published my first pieces in the Summer Harvard Crimson, which was kind enough to take all my drivel about the Soviet Union. So I had some clippings in hand, and I went to New York City, and I, you know, beat on doors, and I eventually got hired by UPI. My father was a pharmacist, and my mother worked for the Public Health Service. They were good federal bureaucrats here in Washington. Nobody in particular. I just came to it of my own accord. I decided I wanted to travel the world. I spoke Russian and French. It was 1972. Nixon was still the president. There was no way I could work for the government because, of course, like all good young people, I hated Nixon. So the Foreign Service was out. I was rather left-wing, so I couldn't go into business. What else was there? There was no other way for me, I thought, to travel the world and have an impact. I think I've come more to the center. I always have I joke with my husband. He used to call me a Bloomingdale's Bolshevik when we first met, and he was rather cynical and hard-bitten and more to the center. Now he's gone more to the left. I think I've gone more to the center. He was a reporter for UPI in Lebanon, covering the Lebanese Civil War, and I was his editor at UPI. And we met when he came back on a home leave. I do have a 15-year-old son who is a wonderful writer, I must say. I hope not, but he's showing dangerous tendencies in that direction. He's a good writer. As a journalist, I've lived in China, Japan, and Egypt. I left UPI, went to work for the New York Times for 6 years, and then I quit to follow my husband to China. He was also a journalist at that time, and I became a freelance journalist. I wrote mostly for The Economist overseas. I loved it. I was able to write with a sense of humor. They didn't mind the occasional sarcastic joke. No byline, which meant I could also write for other people and have a byline in other publications. So it's kind of the perfect freelance gig, I must say. You know, I didn't look. Well, they have their own English language papers, which are easy to get. I think most people access the rest of the English language press online. There was a business center in the hotel, which was one of the reasons I like this hotel, and I could get onto my America Online account and access anything. I certainly wouldn't call the Iranian regime dictatorial and totalitarian. They have given up, as I say. I mean, the young people are on the internet all the time. They have blogs. You can meet people on the street. You give them your card, and you go back to the hotel, and they've sent you an email and a link to their blogs. And this is, you know, they've arrested some people who've had overtly political blogs. But I met all sorts of young people who have blogs where, you know, they simply talk about themselves. They're in touch with people all around the world. It is not a closed country at all. There are a few pockets, perhaps, where this is still difficult to do. Maybe North Korea is the last place on earth where it's still difficult. But Iran is open. We do have some, but it's very difficult for them. Many are going to Britain, they're going to Australia, Canada. It's easier for them to get visas. And as I point out in my articles, I think a lot of Iranians said the best way to influence this country is not to bomb them with bombs, but with visas and visitors. Bring more here, send more Americans there. They want the contact, they're starving for it. And it would have, frankly, more influence on the country. I think it's not that hard as a tourist. There are a lot of agencies that will help facilitate that. And of course, Iran is a gorgeous country, ancient country. There are wonderful things to see there. I wouldn't recommend women going in the summer because you have to cover and it can be excruciatingly hot. But if you want to go from November through March, you can be quite comfortable, stay in good hotels. You won't get sick eating the salad or drinking the water. I mean, this is rather unusual for that part of the world. Good standards of hygiene, reasonable transportation, and people who will love you. Yeah, it goes on. I don't know how many people have 4 wives because, frankly, it's rather expensive. But it's still much easier for a man to divorce his wife and take another one than it would be, I imagine, in any other place. Until recently, I think men could take another wife and not even tell their first wives. I believe that's now illegal. And there is this practice of temporary marriage, which is, as Ms. Nafisi said, basically legalized prostitution. So it's still a man's world. This time I went to Qum, which is their Vatican, their theological center. I wanted to see Iraqis vote. And the largest expatriate Iraqi community that registered to vote is in Iran, and of that group, the largest number, I think something like 50,000 were in Qum. So I went to Qum for the day, and it was quite fascinating. Of course, this is a very conservative town. You don't see that much pink in Qum. The Iranian women and the Iraqi women are by and large wearing chadors there. Very interesting because the Iraqis, of course, were voting with great enthusiasm, and the Iranians were rather envious. They would like to have elections as free as Iraq had. All the Iranian Ayatollahs have their training there, by and large, although many of them also were trained in Iraq, in Najaf. And Najaf now will most likely become the center, the theological center, again, for Shia Islam. That's where it was born. That's where it comes from. Assuming it can be stabilized, I think the fact that there's still so much violence is a disincentive. So you still have a number, I think there are about 10 important Ayatollahs of various nationalities, not just Iranian, who are still based in Qum. You know, average Iranians rather liked it. They say the more pressure that Bush puts on their government, the better it is for them, that the government puts less pressure on them. But it was absolutely lethal for a reform movement within the clerical elite. I mentioned President Khatami. He and those like him who want to reform the system from within were very, very much hurt by this. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, and conservatives in Iran used this language against the reformers and said, see, this is what the United States thinks of you. You have to understand that Iran had just facilitated our toppling of the Taliban. They were the major allies of the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, which really did the overthrowing for us. I mean, we provided technical assistance, air support, and so on, but it was the Northern Alliance, this dissident group within Afghanistan, that overthrew the Taliban. Iranians helped us. They facilitated this, and then Bush turns around and calls them the axis of evil. So there was an enormous sense of betrayal, and it was used against the reformers by the hardliners. It was used to discredit them. I think I quote in this article, several of the reformers is saying it really hurt them. Well, this is a really incendiary question now. Iran is very close to becoming a nuclear power. It has the knowledge to become a nuclear power. Europeans are trying to convince the Iranians to forswear the production of nuclear fuel, which can be used for civilian power reactors or can be used for bombs. They're involved in these negotiations. Britain, France, and Germany are taking the lead on this. The United States is standing aside from the process. President Bush says he supports it, but he hasn't really done much yet to support it. There's a big question about whether the United States will decide to support the Europeans in offering the Iranians some practical incentives not to produce nuclear fuel. Two that the Europeans have requested are to stop blocking Iran's application to join the World Trade Organization and to sell Iran some new airplanes and some spare parts for their old Boeings. Their civilian airliners are falling out of the sky because they are so old. And they want to buy some new ones. They want to get some spare parts. So this has been a request on the part of the Iranians. Now the Bush administration has to decide whether it will agree to this. There's a lot of distrust of Iran, obviously. 2-3 years ago, it was discovered that they had been hiding for 18 years a secret nuclear program. And among the things they were hiding was a huge installation they were constructing at Natanz to enrich uranium. It's south of Tehran, a couple hours south of Tehran. I drove past it. I wasn't supposed to, but it's not very far south of Qum, so I asked if we could just sort of drive past it. And you wouldn't know what it was. It's half underground, and there's sort of these brown berms that camouflage it, but they're anti-aircraft sites and whatnot, a lot of barbed wire and so on, so you know it's a major installation. Most people think they do not yet have weapons, that they're still at the stage where they're perfecting the ability to make the fuel for bombs. Now, the Iranians say that they deny this. They say the fuel will be for a nuclear reactor, a civilian reactor that is being constructed by the Russians at Bushehr. And they say it's within their rights to enrich uranium, and it is, according to the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is completely within their rights to do this. I think they want it because they want reactors. I mean, the Shah wanted 20 reactors. They'd like to be able to sell more of their oil and have nuclear power. They want it for pride because they believe, as a great and ancient civilization, they have a right to the technology. India has it, Russia has it, Pakistan has it. Why shouldn't Iran, is the idea. And they want it to deter the United States and Israel from attacking them. You know, Iran is still listed on our State Department terrorism list as the premier state sponsor of terrorism. It has been for some time. Khobar Towers was a bombing in Saudi Arabia in 1996, killed 19 American airmen. The Iranians did not do this directly, but according to our FBI, they trained Saudi Shia, members of what's called Saudi Hezbollah, who carried out the bombing. And so Iran is held to be responsible. Iran, of course, helped create Hezbollah, which is the Lebanese Shiite organization that in 1983 blew up the Marine barracks, killed 241 Marines. So Iran is blamed for supporting Lebanese, Saudis, others who have killed Americans. The way U.S. officials describe it is that, yeah, they provided the funding, the training. They sent members of their Revolutionary Guard Corps to Iran, Lebanon rather, after the Israeli invasion in 1982, and created this organization from among the Lebanese Shia. I did not. I did a little bit with Hussein Mousavian. And as I mentioned, he's one of the top negotiators with the Europeans, and terrorism is one of the issues. They're not just talking about the nuclear program, they're talking about terrorism, the Arab-Israeli conflict, human rights, and it is one of the issues. And he said that Iran is willing to discuss this issue, that he said the nuclear negotiations could be a model for other negotiations on these other issues. There was so much to talk to them about, frankly, with the nuclear issue, which, as I said, is very hot right now. I did raise it a little bit with Rafsanjani. We talked about, he was talking about how the United States had been so unjust and so on toward Iran, and of course I mentioned the hostage-taking, which was terrorism in the view of the United States and most of the rest of the world, and he said that, we treated the hostages well, and they left Iran in a mellow frame of mind, which I thought was really rather a ridiculous thing to say. Well, if you look at state sponsorship, I mean, look, these things are all in the eye of the beholder. Hezbollah now is a legitimate political party in Lebanon and has a huge network of charities, schools, social organizations. It also has a militant wing, which fought the Israelis and got them to leave southern Lebanon in 2000. So have they supported terrorism in the past? Yes. Are they terrorists now? They would argue that they're not, and the Iranians would argue that they're not. But Iran also supports groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which I would call a terrorist group because it conducts suicide bombings that kill civilians. Tough questions. I mean, if Israel reaches an agreement with the Palestinians, that'll take a lot of the heat out of both these issues, I think. For the United States, I mean, to resume a dialogue with the Iranians, I think progress on the nuclear issue probably would be sufficient right now. Yeah, Rafsanjani was very funny. He said, we're not bothered by all this nonsense. He said, we're used to this nonsense. I asked him about the tough comments that she had made about Iran. He also called her emotional. I think it was actually a male chauvinist remark. He was calling her emotional because she's a woman. He said there really wasn't much difference between her and Colin Powell because, as he put it, the U.S. policy is made elsewhere, not in the State Department. I didn't have a chance to sort of probe that, but I assume he meant that policy is made in the White House. Not as much as they should. There are no women ministers. There's a female vice president who's actually one of the former hostage holders. And she's also, I believe, in charge of the environment. But women are much more important and prominent in Iran than they are in a lot of other Muslim countries. There are a number of members of parliament. They're very prominent in journalism. 60% of the students now are female. And they are tough and feisty. They drive, they do everything. They're not like women in Saudi Arabia who have enormous restrictions on their movement. Iranian women are much freer. No, not in the developing world, but it's a real problem for the Iranian government because these youngsters don't remember the revolution. They truly despise the government and the restrictions that they face, social restrictions that they face. As I pointed out, they want to wear Gap clothes and they want to be free. They want to walk down the street holding the hand of their girlfriend and go to the movies and dance and listen to music, and they don't like the restrictions. Yeah, there are always American movies there, but most people watch on satellite, or they get tapes and CDs and whatnot. They don't have to rely on the movie theaters. Tons. Let's see, Linkin Park is very popular now. Don't ask me what sort of group they are. I've never listened to them. They love heavy metal. Metallica is one of the groups. They know everything. Freedom. They do. They love the tough talk, I thought this was a little surprising because, frankly, some of the things he says make me wince a little bit. They love it. They say that the more pressure on human rights in particular, the more pressure it puts on their own government, the more constraints. They want, certainly our human rights organizations, to keep up the pressure. They have some very brave people like Shireen Ebadi, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003 for her human rights work. She's a lawyer in Iran who does phenomenal things, defending political prisoners, advocating rights for women and children. And the more support we give people like that, the better it is. They've had elections where 70% of the people have turned out, and more. When Khatami was first elected, for example, in parliamentary elections where reformers were running, they've had a very good turnout. So this was really a slap. It was a protest against the parliamentary candidates, the fact that this Council of Guardians, it's called, had disqualified hundreds of reformist candidates. When I travel within the country, I have a driver who I love, who's a wonderful guy. Usually I bring a translator as well, but I also walk around on the streets, quite freely, and I don't feel restricted. I'm wearing a scarf, so I rather blend in, frankly, with the women there. It's easy. It's not that expensive. I'm trying to think what my airfare was. It wasn't bad. It's about $1,700, $1,800 going via Paris. The hotels are very inexpensive. They're about $100 a night. I had a fancy room. It was $120 a night. Quite inexpensive, actually. You could have a very good vacation there. But I would tell them that if you're a female, you're going to have to prepare to cover yourself, which means, long pants, long shirts, and scarves. And you cannot drink in hotels, in public places, in restaurants. So you have to be prepared to have a vacation without alcohol. And that, of course, might be a bit of a disincentive to some. Well, people have, in their private homes, have alcohol, diplomats and so on, but not in the restaurants and the hotels, that sort of thing, no. Well, Islam forbids intoxicants. But of course, a lot of people there take drugs rather openly, so one can say there's another example of hypocrisy. But it forbids intoxicants. Now, in some Muslim countries, places like Egypt and Lebanon, if you're not a Muslim, you're allowed to drink. Iran imposes this restriction on everybody who goes there. Similarly, if you go to Egypt and you're a woman and you're not Muslim, you don't have to cover your hair. Even if you are Muslim, you don't have to cover your hair. But Iran imposes this, and it's a great disincentive to tourism. And if you talk to Iranians in the tourism industry, it's an enormous source of frustration because they know that they would get lots more people if people could have a beer at the end of the day and if the women could walk around in a T-shirt without a headscarf. No. Because they're depriving themselves of income from tourism. It should be a great country for tourism, so it's silly. They can expect that people will be respectful, that women won't walk around in short shorts or wear bikinis or something. That much I suppose they could request. But most intelligent Americans who go to Muslim countries obey a certain voluntary dress code anyway. They would be a little bit conservative in their dress. So there's no need to impose it, in my view. Yeah, people smoke. Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. Unlike Saudi Arabia. Well, it's not okay to take drugs, but a lot of people do because it's easier to get heroin in that country than it is to get a drink. It's rather silly, huh? I don't know. I think it may be slowed, they may be able to slow the progress of the program. A lot depends on the Bush administration and whether the Bush administration decides to support the Europeans or not. If the Bush administration decides not to, these negotiations aren't going anywhere. It may be that they're not going anywhere even if the United States does sign on. I thought it was an important impact. Now, a lot depends obviously on what happens in Iraq and whether that country can be stabilized. I mean, the death toll there is awful, and Iranians are well aware of the chaos and what has happened there. But the elections themselves were very popular in Iran. They were a source of envy. So if Iraq can get its act together, I think it will have an impact. I think you may see that this Council of Guardians that I mentioned will be a little less restrictive perhaps the next time. You know, they have presidential elections coming up in June. Presumably they'll permit 2 or 3 candidates to run, and whether they'll permit anybody who is a real opposition figure, I don't know, but it will have an impact. You know, there is something afoot in the region. You feel it. You feel it in Iran. You feel it in many places. Now in Iran, there is a history going back to 1906 when they had their first constitutional revolution, a history of seeking democracy. It's very strong there, and as I pointed out, if they could vote freely, they would have a democracy, and a real one, tomorrow. Oh, brother, that's tough. So many people I met. It's really hard to choose. There was a young blogger I met who made a big impact on me. But Rafsanjani and his son, I would say, the two of them together. Meeting Rafsanjani because he's a historical figure, somebody I had always wanted to meet, and his son because he was so honest about the kinds of changes that he thought his father would bring to the country. I would say the change in the clothing and the social environment. Being able to sit in a restaurant in a pantsuit, not having to wear a coat, was personally really nice, and to walk on the streets just wearing a jacket and a pair of pants, to be able to wear my blue jeans in public was very liberating. So, you know, everything's relative. The worst part of the trip. There was no worst part of the trip. It was a great trip. I really enjoyed it. The only worst part, no internet access from my room, which meant that every time I wanted to get on the internet to talk to my editors or anybody, I had to put a scarf on and a jacket and go downstairs and sit in the business center. That's still a little bit difficult. Otherwise, there was no worst part.